Yeah. If I
Neeraj,
pronounce it wrong, don't mind, okay? Mr. Combe Carpentier D. Gordon, right? Is currently the consultant with the India Foundation and is also the convener of the editorial board of the World Affairs Journal. He's associate of the International Institute of Social and Economic Studies, Vienna, Austria, and a member of the advisory board of the Paris, Berlin, Moscow, etc. Combe Carpentier is an author. He's written almost 6 books and 70 articles with and interesting information about him, which I've come to know, is that he was chosen in 2009 as among the 100 most original thinkers by CII, the Confederation of Indian Chamber of Commerce. He has done lectures at over 100 conferences internationally, and he has been associated with the most prominent organizations internationally, whether it is UNESCO or trade related. And so if I read this, I will be taking more than 20 minutes of Combs time, but we'll be doing a formal recording as we go along. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Comb. It's always a pleasure to welcome you and listen to you and interact with you on so many issues of culture, which you have been with us for, I think, almost now 8 to 9 years. So without much ado, I would like to hand over to Aryan to just give a brief, introduction how we proceed, and then RC Shri Ranjit Chaturvedi ji will say a few words, and then I must introduce the three of them to you. You must know this. Shri Ranjit Chaturvedi is a businessman and industrialist. He has businesses across India and abroad. But something, I think the COVID has done a lot of good also to a lot of us. And he sort of came to Mathura and he got connected with Ma Yamuna, and he undertook over almost, I think, I know how many months, Padyatra, right from Yamunotri till Mathura via Delhi. In between, doing a lot of cultural activities and programs, and one of them was also at Delhi, where the Krishna and Kalindri Vivah took place, and I was fortunate to be a part of this. He is very enterprising in terms of wanting to do much more for our cultural heritage, and he has promised me now to spend 99% of his time in India. He can do his business in 1% traveling and doing it on the net nowadays. So that's his passion for this thing. And he's been, I think he started now penning things on Yamuna, for which we have decided to do the book together after my Ganga book that that I have already completed. And Aryan, I have already told you, is a creative person. He runs his own startup, which is called Chrysol's Media. And he has also one distinction. He launched the first web series way back, I think in the early 2000s, something that he will tell you. And it was called Run something, which is related to, again, cricket and
Run Bhumi, which was repeating
Run Bhumi. Yeah. So I was introduced to him through that. Remember that Indic group that is there, the international, the diaspora people have, that with them, one of the programs from many years ago. So he's a contributor, as I've just said, he contributes by doing our small films and our promos and, little things for us, always there to help the trust out for the outreach, because as he just explained to you, he is also passionate. Our cultural roots should be unearthed, nourished, and propagated to the youth of the country, the coming generation. We have somebody also very interesting with us, Shri Pawan Agarwal ji. Lieutenant General Chaturvedi Vishnukant at IIF India Foundation, who comes over there and who's related to me. He introduced me to Pawan Agarwal ji some years ago. Pawan Agarwal ji is a leading publisher. You've heard of Prabhat Prakashan. And he also runs a magazine on defense affairs, which is a big outreach for different strategies, etc. So I think there is some connect between the two of you, because I have shared your CV with him. And he also gets associated with the trust because he wants to contribute something in the field of culture. And he's been toying with the idea कि मैं film करूँ, कि Netflix वाली करूँ, कि TV serial वाली करूँ, and we keep discussing. But I think now Aryan is with him, and I think Aryan and RC are on the same page. So we have somebody who has been thinking on those lines. So the three people are connected. So without much ado, I think I will now hand over to Aryan to just please say a few words, and then RC, and if Pavanji would like to say something, and we continue.
Thank you very much. In fact, first of all, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद and welcome everyone for your precious time. And I think a little कहते हैं बूंद बूंद करके सागर बनता है. ठीक है, हम सारे छोटे छोटे अभी थोड़ी देर पहले अग्रवाल साहब बोल रहे थे कि बूंद बूंद करके सागर बनते हैं, और हमें भी एक ऐसे ही सागर बनाना है, ठीक है, जो हमारे अगले पीढ़ी आने वाले पीढ़ियों का प्यास मिटा सके. So that's what we are aiming at with Indraprastha talks. The main agenda for Indraprastha talk is to dig more and find, evaluate more, and evolve our culture a little more, and introduce the essence of our culture in a contemporary form to our youth. Because we believe अगर ये culture और ये heritage हम अगर अपने youth को नहीं दे सकें, तो हम जितनी मेहनत हम आज कर रहे हैं, okay, that is of no use, because they are the one who is going to build the future world. Forget India. I think they are going to build the future world. And when we talk about Vasudev Kutumbakam, which is the essence of our culture, they are the true ambassador of our essence, and we should work towards that. So this is one of the small steps जहाँ पे हम अपने अपने एक्सपर्टीज के थ्रू जुड़ने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि अपने नॉलेज से, we have the stalwarts like you guys, like we have stalwarts like Niraji and Aap, okay, you, then we have different mindsets and thinkers like RC and probably me, and then we have Agarwal Sahab and many others. Combined together, probably we can find a way. So this is just the beginning. So we want to go much ahead and introduce the real essence of true Vasudev Kutumbakam and the real essence of India, the real strength of culture to India. So first of all, I'll again welcome Ms. Kom. I had an opportunity to meet you. You remember we had a small discussion with Dr. Mani and Niraji. We wanted to start something called Mahabharat Manthan, but somehow due to COVID and stuff, we had to hold that out. But today, I think it's again a very humble beginning, like Sankhnath, we can say. So for that Sankhnath, I think one of the best thing to begin with will be Indraprastha, where we begin, because that's the point where our bricks and jar they come together. So I'll set it with RC. RC, you can go ahead and quickly give your opinion, and let's start listening to Kom. And I have a lot of questions for him today. I'm going to quench my thirst for him.
No, I just want to listen to him. I want to start by that. And maybe if I have any questions, then I will join in later. But I'm here to be a listener primarily today. Now, welcome to your Kom.
Thank you. Perfect. Kom, it's on your stage.
Pavanji would like to say anything, we can.
Well, I ditto RG that we would like to listen to Mr. Kom, because our culture is so fascinated that he has been associated with it for such a long time. So I'm sure that what he delivers, during our discussions would be beneficial to have more knowledge, and we can disseminate the same knowledge to our youth. So over to you, Mr. Kom. I think we'll be all benefited with your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pranam, Namaskar. Thank you, Niraji, for organizing this after so many other very auspicious and enlightening occasions in which we have gone into many different facets of Indian civilizational traditions and culture and symbology, and also very, if I might say, hard historical facts. Now, I want to make a few general statements leading up to the topic at hand, because I do not claim to be able to teach anything to scholars, Indian scholars of their own history. Many of them are far more versed than I am in some of the intricacies of the historical legacy in the Mahabharata. But my advantage is that I have been trained in both in certain aspects of Indology as well as in world history and anthropology of other parts of the world. Therefore, I can see connections that may not be so apparent sometimes to people who are focused on Indian studies. And I know that certain students of ancient history have made connections with other parts of the world in the remote past. Some of them are very interesting, others are much harder to prove and sometimes can be disproven. So we should be careful, obviously, not to draw too many facile analogies which can be refuted and which can make us all look like we are not very scientific. You know, I am referring to certain things that P.N. Oak wrote about, which are highly controversial. So the idea is not to just find immediate and obvious connections with everything, but to single out the very interesting ones, which can actually be proven. And this, as we shall see, is particularly true of the lore that surrounds Indraprastha. Now, there is an interesting thing which is common to all religious history. You know, history and religion are intertwined. And despite the diversity of religions, and very often their contradictions, the historical phenomenon of religion is very similar in its evolution all over the world. Religions go through a series of stages, and generally you might say that they start with what we might call the cosmic or natural state, where all the forces of nature are worshipped, and often under animal or human forms. But then eventually that religion becomes somehow remote for people. And it happens that great figures, prophets, sages, rishis, come and they are eventually or gradually connected to the underlying divine energies. So they become very often the new gods. And as a result, some of the old gods, including Indra, are gradually neglected. And even Brahma, who was the creator of the universe, no longer is worshipped except in 3 temples in India. And many other Vedic gods have become figures of mythology more than figures of actual worship. So that is a natural process, which we could already notice at the time when Gautama Buddha came on the scene. And it has happened all over the world. So it's not unique to India. Now, it happens that, there are 2 ways to interpret the phenomenon. There is what you might call the anthropological interpretation, which is called evemeristic, which assumes that very great figures came on earth as human beings and became gods in the popular belief. Of course, for people who follow that interpretation, Lord Ram was a king and a hero, and then he became a god since he was the avatar of Vishnu. And the same can be said about Shri Krishna and about a number of other figures who gradually eclipsed the ancient forms of divinity. So that is something which, I cannot cite a better example than Christianity, where people who followed the traditional Greek, Roman religions of the Mediterranean, and those who followed the old Semitic Jewish creed, eventually many of them saw Christ as not only the Son of God, but God himself, even though he was still a historical figure who had been born and who had died. So you can see the parallels here, that the old God of the Bible and the gods of the Greeks gradually were subsumed into the figure of Jesus. For example, Jesus in his initial representations were shown as Apollo, the sun god. And it's only later that you found the god with a beard, or rather the figure with a beard and long hair, but originally he was the sun god. So that gives you an example of how figures of worship evolve and oscillate between divinity and humanity. Why am I saying this as an introduction? Just to remind you that Indraprastha is, of course, is the city of Arjuna, which he founded for him and his 4 brothers, and which was eventually ruled by the eldest brother, Yudhishthira. And therefore, Yudhishthira being the incarnation of Dharma, Indraprastha became the seat of Dharma, the central city of the 5 of the Pandavas. And as we know, the 5 cities are still there. So there is something deeply historical which remains in place, and these names haven't changed. So it shows that, except for Delhi, of course, because Indraprastha was eventually subsumed into Delhi, and everybody forgot about the pre-Islamic cities that had occupied the site. So I know that one of the ambitions of Niraji and of quite a few other people would be to restore the original name of Indraprastha to Delhi. But the other aspects of Delhi's foundation have to do, of course, with the fact that it was called Indraprastha. It was part of the Kuru land, but it was a wild, unsettled land, or if it was settled, it was not an organized city. And it was occupied by the Takshakas, and Takshak or Takshaka was the figure who essentially was the lord of the land. And by burning that wilderness, the stage was set for the creation of the new city. And as we all know, Mayasura was spared by Arjuna, and as an act of gratitude, he offered to build the great Sabha. So there is a debate as to whether there was anything like a city before that, or if the city was built from scratch. But the fact is that the Sabha was very much the founding monument of Pandava rule. And we know that Maya, a great architect and a great magician, went to the Himalayas to retrieve some hidden treasures. Some list of objects is given. And in some versions, that list of objects included the Bhauda Vajra, which is essentially the Vajra of Indra, because Indra was the ruler of that land of Indraprastha. So the city was in a way dedicated to him. And they say that the Vajra of Indra, which is made of diamond, and the diamond is actually the bones of Rishi Dadhich. So as a result, you have this merger of the Vedic, you might say, iconography with the foundation of a city which was to be I will say, a sort of an earthly image of the heavenly Sabha of Indra. And now that, of course, brings us to the very image of Indra. Number one, I want to point out that the tradition of burying or finding certain hidden objects in certain specific places, and in the case of the foundation of Indraprastha, the specific objects were found in Lake Bindusara in the Himalayas north of Kailash. So there is a deep connection with, of course, Lord Shiva and with the other divinities of the Himalayan pantheon. And interestingly, in Tibetan Buddhism, which is largely inherited from the Bon tradition of Tibet, the tradition of looking for hidden objects which have been buried there by sages long time ago is very alive. They are called the terma, and the people who find them are tertons. So there is that Himalayan tradition inherited from the original Vedic culture, because we can imagine that there was a great deal of interaction between the Vedic culture and the Himalayan cultures to the north, which were pervaded by each other. So that's where you see the creation of Indraprastha becoming the seat of the Pandavas. And then we know what happens after the great Sabha is built, when you know, there are all these great ceremonies held to dedicate the city, and all the gods come and visit it and are impressed by splendor, just as all the kings are. And of course, that leads us to throw a little bit of an eye back to the history of the Pandavas, because we know that the Pandavas are a branch of the Kuru household, of the Kuru clan. And the Kuru clan was predominant in northwestern India and beyond, because we hear very early about, in the Mahabharata also, about the Uttara Kurus, which Arjuna visited during his Digvijaya to the north. And the Uttara Kurus obviously appear to have had a connection with the Kurus, but there is a reason from outside India to believe that the Kurus did really rule a large part of what is now India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, because we find traces of them in other historical accounts, such as, for example, the rather famous Babylonian, or I would say rather Urukian, because it came from Uruk, which was part of Mesopotamia or Chaldea. There we have the novel of Enmerkar, which is about 4,000 years old. And in the novel of Enmerkar, you hear about a particular king who built the Babel Tower, as it came to be known in the Jewish scriptures. But that king was in contact with a land to the northeast called Kura. And the mountain part of that kingdom was called Aratta. And Aratta and Kura are often seen together. And we know that that king led an expedition to Kura, Aratta. In fact, in the Mahabharata, you are told about an Aratta, which is located in the Indus Punjab region. And Kura may very well have been the land of the Kurus, which you find all over. You find traces of that name all over the Near and Middle East, all the way to Greece and beyond. For example, we know that King Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire much later in the 6th century BCE, was actually known as Kurosh, and may very well have claimed a family connection with the Kurus. But also, if you look at the earliest Greek divine statues, they are known as the Kuroi. They are Kurus, and they are always statues of young men. The first ones are, of course, rather primitive and geometric, but then as the Greek art evolved, they became more and more attentive to the human form, and they represented these young men as very handsome gods who bear gifts and who are protectors. And you can see here a trace of the whole, essentially the whole choreography of the Kurus, which in Greek had a long history, because apart from the Kuros, you can find them in all the great museums of Greece, including the Acropolis Museum. But then, of course, that gave rise to the name Kuria, which in Greek means the court of the king. So in other words, the Kurus were those who were the masters of the court, where their vassals and their subjects congregated. And the Curia is still present in the Roman papal hierarchy, because the kings, not the Roman emperor's court was called the Curia, and the Pope's court is called the Curia. So you still have that trace of the Kuros and Curia in the West, which eventually gave rise in English to the court, which means the court of the king, or the court of justice, because the king rendered justice in a court. So you can see here the deep penetration of what is conventionally known as the Indo-European heritage, which reached all the way to Central Asia, Russia, Eastern and Western Europe, Ireland. So what is rather extraordinary about it is that it is not confined to the Greeks and Romans in Southern Europe. It also pervades Northern Europe. In other words, you find traces of that common heritage among the Germans, among the Scandinavians, the Swedes, Norwegians, among the Britons, the inhabitants of the British Isles, the Celts, and the people who came and went, the Gauls in France, who still had Sanskritic names and still had very Sanskritic concepts in their form of government. For example, the central tribe of the Gauls was called, the Romans called them the Biturigi, but in fact, if you go back to the original Gaulish or Celtic name, it was the Vasturaj, so the king of the land. And as a matter of fact, they were known as the kings of the world. And they did conquer a lot of land. They went all the way to Rome before Rome became an empire, when Rome was still a tiny republic. And they actually conquered Rome and plundered it, and they practically destroyed it. So you have that evidence that Indo-European people speaking Sanskritic-derived languages were very much present all over the Eurasian continent. We all know about the penetration of Indian religion, culture, mythology in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, China and Japan, Korea. But we are less aware of their penetration across Iran and Central Asia. all the way to Europe. And as I said before, even the Celts, where you find the images of Narada, called Nuada, and the Tara, the capital city, and so many other symbols. Tara, by the way, is symbolized by the stone, the Fiannafial, which is actually a lingam in shape. And then you have all those different, I mean, the names have remained the same. For example, the whole esoteric lore of secret power and magical gifts in Old Irish is called Sidhe. Sidhi. So they haven't changed that, and they kept that all along. So to give that background is to show the relevance of the concept of Indraprastha as an imperial city, even outside India. And in one of the writings that I did for a publication that Nira Mishra got together, I mentioned that particular reference to Prastha, which is the the sort of generally flat land where the king builds his city and where he also has the fields that enable him to feed the population. So the Prasta, which became Pratum in Latin, and which gave rise to the oldest city of Greece called Platea, which originally was known as Plataea. So again, you find Prasta in a different, slightly different pronunciation. So you can see that this is a very present concept, and Indraprastha being the land of Indra, under the protection of Indra, is obviously you might say, the imperial capital of India, which took away the supremacy of Hastinapura. And that in itself seems to have universalized the kingdom of the Kurus under the Pandavas into something much bigger, much larger, which became almost a pan-Indian empire, as far as we can tell. Of course, the pan-Indian empire was highly affected by the war, which devastated a lot of lands and killed a lot of people, but still, that tradition of having a very widespread empire centered in Indraprastha survived the centuries, because we find almost all dynasties trying to conquer Delhi and build their empire around it, because owning that particular piece of land was seen as a symbol of legitimacy as far as supremacy over, Bharat, Aryavarta, as you wish to call it. It can be, it can be sort of symbolized by that. So this leads us to the fact that it would, of course, be very important to revive that heritage in name and deed by giving Delhi, the name Indraprastha as well. Actually, India is also known as Bharat in the constitution. So there is no reason why Delhi could not be known also as Indraprastha, to give people a choice if some of them are not comfortable for any reason. It can still be known as Delhi Indraprastha. And by the way, as our friend Conrad Elst has very perceptively argued in a recent article, this is also a very secular concept, because Indra is no longer an object of worship for a particular religion. It is actually a symbol of the father god, of the god of the sky and of thunder. He is also the god of water in some ways, because he is the one who essentially weaves the Indrajal, the weave of Indra, the net of Indra, which is considered to be watery, but which is also a net in the sense in which the Buddhists see it when they describe the net of Indra as a very image of the universe. And quantum physics has very much appreciated that symbol, because in quantum physics, the universe is a net of particles which are constantly interacting and reflecting each other, which are in fact interchangeable. So there is a deep scientific awareness and a very telling analogy behind that concept of Indra's net. So what we have before us is the realization of a image of divinity, of what you might call the Father God, that we can locate in almost every major civilization of the Near and Middle East, not to mention Eastern Europe, for example, Swarog among the Balkanic peoples, and Perun for the primitive Russians, for the the Slavs, the Slavs of Russia before Russia was conquered by the Nordics, by the Vikings. And likewise, we can find this kind of connection among, the gods of Scandinavia and also the gods of the Romans, of course. Jupiter is very much an incarnation of Indra. And therefore, it's a very powerful symbol of the supremacy of heaven over the earth. And we can see that apart from those theological and cosmological concepts, many of the original principles of politics and government that you find in India in the culture of the Mahabharata are preserved by many other peoples all over the world, as far as, for example, the concept of power, how it is symbolized and how it is passed on. Just as the Indian kings, Rajas, used to divide their lands among their sons, you find that among, for example, the Germanic tribes, who also, in which the kings kept dividing their lands among their sons. And that's how, for example, Germany ended up having more than 360 kingdoms or states, simply because every king kept splitting his land for giving some piece of it to his children. By the way, that was not a very fortunate turn of events, because both India and Germany were for centuries dominated by their neighbors, because kingdoms had become so small and were constantly fighting among each other, so they couldn't defend very well the common land. And that was the fate of the German Empire until 1870, when Bismarck reunified it. Of course, many people said that he shouldn't have done it, because afterwards we got Hitler, which was a lot less interesting, which wouldn't have happened if Germany hadn't been unified. But anyway, the history is that a land that is divided too often ends up, breaking down and losing its ability to protect itself. But still, it's very interesting that the concept of sovereignty and inheritance has remained pretty much the same among many of the Indo-European peoples, which showed a very strong imprint of the original culture. Now, this, as we all know, still meets with a lot of resistance in many parts of the world, in the West and elsewhere, because you say you are being a Hindu chauvinist and you try to bring everything back to India. And of course, other people have their pride too, so they love to say, no, we are also the source, because we have this great culture and our ancestors were amazing. But it's a much bigger vision that we have to have and pass on. It's not a matter of simply one country taking over all others. It's more of a matter of a very powerful common culture, which originally seems to have been centered in the subcontinent, and which spread out through the routes of migrations, provoked partly by climate and partly by human factors, which led to this sharing of many common traits. I mean, when the Roman historian Tacitus tells you that the Germans had Indian priests, somehow the Western historians tend to have ignored that, saying, well, that didn't make any sense. How could Indians have gone all the way there? But then you understand why the Germans said they were descended from Twistir, which they called Twisto, or at least the Romans called it Twisto, and that Twistir's son was Manus, and that he was the ancestor of the Germans, so Manu. So these kind of things cannot be invented. There are a number of coincidences that can be fortuitous. People can come up.
Received from Conby 2.
They can come up with the same ideas and the same images simply because these images and ideas are fairly easy to come to. But in some cases, there are so many coincidences that there is more than that. There is an actual communication. There is an actual transfer of information. And that explains a lot about the history of the world, which is why the Germans, right from the beginning of let's say the late 18th century, became convinced that they were very closely related to India. Originally, they thought they had come from India, and then that didn't sound very fashionable because India was being conquered. So the Indians were seen as the more and more subject people. So the Germans preferred to believe that they actually were the original Indians, Indo-Europeans, and that some of them had gone to India and spawned there a lot of the Indian civilization. It was much more flattering to them, which many other people have done. The Ukrainians tell you that they are the land where Indo-European civilization was born. And the Russians tend to say the same thing, and quite a few other lands make the same claim. So it's inevitable. There is an element of political, egocentrism that goes into that. But if we look at the facts, and if we study the epigraphic the archaeological and other evidence, I think we can come more and more to an understanding of what really happened. And I do agree that all attempts by astronomers to find exact dates for things have always run into problems, because a lot of different astronomers or archaeoastronomers are convinced that they got the right dates, and the more precise they are, the more controversial they are, because I mean, they all have very good data, except when you look at the data interpreted by another one, you realize that these data are not necessarily clinched. So you have to keep some element of skepticism and openness about it. And I don't think, by the way, precise dates are so essential in ancient history. They may be very important when you talk about events that took place in the last 200 years, but if you are going back thousands of years, an approximate period is good enough, because it's not as if the fact that it was a Wednesday and not a Friday will change a lot to anything. And so I think we should avoid not getting stuck on dates which expose us to the criticism that we are just being unscientific, and that we are too dogmatic, and that we just impose theories and believe them to be facts. So I think that we have to keep our ability to discuss these things and listen to various theories and offer a range of options, which still are not entirely contradictory with each other, but which come within a certain frame of reference. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that the more archaeological discoveries are made in India and elsewhere, the clearer the evolutionary picture we get, and the more likely we will be to understand exactly what happened more or less when. I think excavations in the Indraprastha area and in other parts of Greater Delhi are very important, just as they should be pursued in the other four prasthas, Bhakprastha, Soniprastha, Paniprastha, and the Tilaprastha, which obviously it's not easy, because there is a lot of construction, and it's not easy to dig under people's houses or properties. So there is a limit to what you can do. But hopefully some new finds like the Sanoli chariot will be made, which will clarify the situation. And I think that's about all I wanted to say in this brief overview, because there is so much more that could be added, but I think that essentially encapsulates some important facts about the connection of Delhi to Indra, and the connection of Indra to world mythology and history. One last historical connection which I like to make is that Indra gave rise to the word, in Greek word, in andros, which means the man, the man in the superior sense of the term, the male. And andros in turn evolved into, in India you have Devendra, Hitendra, Surendra, Mahendra. But in the West we have Saint Andrew, who is Saint Andros. And Saint Andros is shown to be crucified, because many of the original saints had to be crucified to keep up with Jesus. And he's crucified on a cross, which is the Vajra cross, which means it is a cross which is in which the two arms are actually oblique and are intersecting, but they are equal. They are not, it's not the standing cross, it is, if you like, the lying cross. So there is a connection with Indra and the Vajra in Saint Andrew, who is the patron saint of Russia, by the way. So a very powerful Slavic symbol, originally a god, because when Christianity became monotheistic, it couldn't do with gods, so it had to make them into saints, and a lot of that has happened. Just as in other religions, saints have become gods, and in fact in Christianity, especially in Catholicism, saints are practically worshipped like gods, so the difference between them is not so strong. And when people say, oh, you have monotheistic religions and polytheistic religions, actually the difference is not so sharp. And there is a great deal of intermingling, except of course when you come into a very strictly, supposedly monotheistic religion like Judaism or Islam. But even Islam, as you know, has always been in a big internal conflict about whether or not saints should be worshipped. And a lot of the Muslims, especially the Sufis, worship certain saints, which you might say radical or fundamentalist Muslims try to eliminate and destroy, sort of wipe out of the common memory, because they believe this is a form of polytheism. It is a return to paganism. So you can see how instinctively the human soul is polytheistic, in the sense that it needs many symbols and many different personalities to channel its spiritual energy. And that is, I think, the benefit of Hinduism, that it has kept a very resolutely open frame of reference in which so many divine embodiments are honored and worshipped. And even when they are not worshipped, they are still remembered, like Indra. So thank you.
Uh, that's fantastic, Kom. Really interesting. You've taken us around the whole world. Pavanji has to leave, so he wants to ask his first question. And then RC, आप देखो जरा please, you're taking the question answer, so please just request Pavanji to take on ask his question, and then you can open it to everybody.
Yes, I think Mr. Agarwal, आप अपना सवाल पूछ लीजिए, ठीक है? हमारे
Yeah,
पास
I just have a very small question from Pong. You know, as we see the cultural heritage of Sanatan Dharma, which covers almost all the domain of our cultural activities, our values, and as you see the conflict on the globe, what do you think that in the coming years would we be able to sustain our same values in India and abroad? Because I could see that in many foreign countries, people are adopting the Hinduism values, or rather, I should say, Sanatan values. So, do you think there is a threat, and will we be able to save that?
The answer is complex because, on the one hand, most ancient religions are in some kind of trouble, and there is in many people there is a loss of faith in ancient traditions, which they often compensate by adopting new creeds, and the new creeds are of any sort and kind. So, for example, a lot of people abroad are now following certain Hindu traditions or certain Hindu gurus, certain paramparas, and it doesn't mean that they understand the scope and the reference of Sanatan Dharma as a whole. You know, this becomes more of a personalized worship or a set of practices which may be either mystical or ritualistic, but without necessarily having the greater picture in mind. On the other hand, people who are philosophically minded, like some of the great scientists, physicists, and biologists, they can become very convinced that the teachings of Vedanta, Buddhist psychology, Tantra, and other schools of Indic thought, they carry very deeply valuable notions which are scientifically validated. So, in that sense, they may be completely open to the wisdom of India, even though they do not often understand it, because it turns out that many of the scientifically minded people are not religiously minded, and vice versa. People who are interested in religion, they don't care much about science, and there can be crossovers, but it's not often the case. So, as a result, what I would say is that first, it's important that India keeps its tradition alive and doesn't get taken over by commercialization and sort of cosmopolitan, like many Indians in the US have become. The young generation, where basically they don't know much about India anymore, and sometimes they don't even like it, and they become left-wing activists. Like we know some of the famous cases. Even those who are in Congress, in the US Congress, and now they have become very vehement against India because they think India is a country of, feudalism and patriarchy and Hindu chauvinism and Brahmins, etc., etc. So that to them is anathema. And so sometimes they have a kind word for Buddhism, but they don't accept the Hindu culture because they think it's just backward and all that. So there has to be some real work done so that a lot of younger people do not go this way in India too. Beyond that, I do think that eventually religions are all restructured and reformed, and that some new kinds of practices are coming up. Some of which may be very deeply in this Indic in background. For example, people who follow Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, they may not know everything about Hinduism, but they do basically adhere to Indic concepts. And the same is true of people who follow Tibetan Buddhism, even there. So there is hope, but there is also a big danger. And the fact is that you cannot keep religions intact as they were, because the world changes and religions change too. You cannot keep them as in a museum. But you have at least to keep the basic values and to make people aware of the past of that religion. Even if they are not going to, are not going to go back to maybe Vedic practices and worship, the various deities, Varuna and Agni, and maybe they won't, but at least they will understand what that meant, and they may practice in a different way, like many people now do. They don't practice yajnas, but they sing bhajans, and evolution is there for sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kom. I'm really delighted and honored to interact with you. I'm sorry I have to leave with some guests. So it will be a wonderful pleasure to connect with you sometime again. Thank you, Mr. Aryan. Thank you, Neeraji. Namaskar. Thank you. Please carry on.
Yes, Mr. Lal, we have been waiting for a question from you for a long time. Please.
Well, Kom, merci beaucoup for the lovely chat. I've been doing a lot of business in the Francophone Africa, in the Sahel region. Yes, they have built a school in my name in Mali. There are about 125 children who are studying there. It's called École Scolaire Ranjit Chaturvedi.
Oh, good, wonderful, congratulations. So you brought I guess you're one of the Mathura Chaturvedis, so you brought the Mathura Chaturvedis to Mali.
I am the Mathura Chaturvedi, yes.
Yeah, of course.
And
that's my connection with him.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
In fact, there's another theory about us Chaturvedis that when Alexander came to India and how the priests, they stayed back. So that's another theory. But I'll get to what you said about how it all started from nature, then to animals, and then to humans when it comes to religion and spirituality, and how it oscillates between divinity and humanity. So when we see the Greek mythology or the Greek religion, we had Zeus, who was just like Indra, and Zeus had sons like Hercules, like Perseus, and Indra had a son like Arjuna. So there was the age of gods, because Indra had to get back to his father. He had to fight the Titans and Maya and that whole story. And then we had the age of gods, so that so Perseus and Hercules, they got back to their father. So this is what we call the age of the gods and age of the heroes. So the age of the heroes usually sends a message for the future generation to come, because they are the ones who sacrifice themselves. So I think this is something similar which had happened to the Pandavas. So being they have left a message which we are still discussing today. What they went through. It could be Draupadi, it could be, and Krishna was the architect of the whole thing. So this is just one common thing that I feel is that we too in India, we talk about the Satya Yuga, the Dwapar Yuga, the Treta Yuga. So it is common to these ages that people in Middle Europe or the Mediterranean believe was the age of the gods and the age of the heroes. So that's how we are oscillating between divinity and humanity, I think, and where we have started to see demigods with some powers obtained from these divine beings. And so this is just one observation. And my question is, why Yamuna? I'm bringing Yamuna in this is because they say the Saraswati is the cradle of life, and so is the Nile. And India and Africa were one at some point. And when they moved, the Rift Valley, they can say that the ancient humans can be traced to the Rift Valley. And then we have Saraswati, the ancient civilizations, the older civilizations. So all Saraswati and Nile. And then between Saraswati and Yamuna, you have this entire Kurukshetra. And everybody wants a piece of Indraprastha, you said. The Mughals wanted to make Indraprastha the capital. Why Yamuna? Do you think there is something about Yamuna, about this land, that we need to research on? Because Yamuna is considered to be the daughter of Sun. She's supposed to be the brother of Shani. She's also supposed to be the sister of Shani and the sister of Yabraj. She was the firstborn twin of the sun god, and all of that stuff. So why Yamuna? Why is Indraprastha on the banks of Yamuna? That is my question. And do we need more research on this?
And obviously,
You can say again.
there is the research certainly should be done, because the fact that there is that reference to, the best land on earth, Brahmavarta, which is a bit north of Delhi, around Kurukshetra, the Dvaravati and all that. That is definitely a very strong message that this was a cradle of the Brahmavarta, Aryavarta civilization, and Ila, the famous Ila, the daughter of Manu, so Ilavarta, and that Ila you find with the Greeks, who were known as the daughters of the sons of Ila, the Hellenes. And so that is in itself an indication that there is a very deep and ancestral connection. So obviously the rivers, we all know that these rivers have all played a very critical role, and we know that at least part of the so-called Indus Valley population, when the Indus Valley dried out and the Saraswati dried out, they moved to east, many of them, especially those on the Saraswati, but even probably the Westerners on the Indus, because they were probably also under pressure from some Western marauders and raiders. So they moved east, and on their way, some of them settled on Yamuna, and others went to Ganga, and that's how you get this gradual, series of settlements that appear further and further east until they reach Bengal. So clearly, Yamuna is a center between, between the Ganga and the rivers of the Punjab. The Greeks were originally convinced that the Indus and the Nile were the same river. When Alexander got to the Indus, he sent an expedition with Nearchus to try to get from down the Indus and then trying to find the Nile. And of course, they ended up in the Arabian Sea. And at that time, they couldn't tell whether or not it was true. But they said both rivers are crocodiles, so clearly the Indus and the Nile are the same river. Anyway, all this is to show that that connection between India and Egypt is a very long established tradition. And I'm sure that, there are large numbers of mysteries to be still unveiled in that region. And so I'm sure there will be lots of very interesting finds around the Yamuna as well. One of the problems with, of course, India is that it's highly populated. So, as I said, you cannot easily discover all things, because either they have been destroyed or they have been buried under many feet of land, of soil, or they are just under land, under cultivated fields and houses, and then how do you get there? But I'm sure there is so much to be found.
My other question is, do you think that we have reached a point where we have to again go back to worshipping these natural elements, these natural forces, which we used to do? Like you said, it began from nature and then it eventually came down to humans or human form.
Yeah, I'm not sure. In a way, in many cases we do, even without fully recognizing it. But it's true that it makes a lot of sense, especially in this time of ecological crisis and collapse. It makes a lot of sense to emphasize the divinity of natural forces, elements, whether they are animals, plants, rivers, mountains, every aspect of the ecosystem. Because otherwise our industrial civilization has wiped out a lot of that wealth, of that sacredness, by saying, well, it's all to be exploited, it's all there for us to make money and to satisfy our needs. So that has to change, and I don't know if we can bring people back to actual worship of nature. Some people do it and are very happy to do it. Others may not find it so easy because they have been brought up in a different way. But then again, what is worship? Worship is a form of honoring and taking care of. So if you want to work to really protect animals and rivers, oceans, mountains, forests, you almost have to worship them. It's because you become their custodian, so they become your and you cannot exploit them just like property. It has to have an element of sacredness. It's very interesting if you read the Bible that wherever the Israelites went in the land of Canaan, they cut down the sacred groves. Why? Because they were people of the desert and they didn't understand the groves, and they were told that some bad gods lived there, so they were enemies of their own God. So they basically cut the groves down, and they felt they were making a clean space for their own civilization. But that's something that shows the problems with monotheism, when you decide that your God is the only one and he's like that, and everybody else has to worship him, and no other God is worthy of any respect. So I think that, going back to, I'm sure that people eventually always want human forms. It's very telling how, however much you try to be uniconic, in the sense, however much you try to have a religion that has no images, people will still be looking for images, because they need it. There is a part of us which needs an image, and the image often has to be as human as possible, because that's what makes us connect. It's much harder to find spiritual connection with the mountain, or for most people. Most people want to have a spiritual connection with Lord Ram or Shri Krishna or Jesus or any saint or so. I mean, there is to be a balance. I think once again, what we have to avoid is monotheistic fanaticism. Essentially realize that there are lots of worship, forms of worship, and there are many elements and creatures to be worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yes, I do have a few questions, but before that, I'll
Somebody's
ask.
raising their hand, Aryan.
I think Mr. Lal wants to ask. He's very eager to ask few questions. I'll hand it over to Mr. Lal, please. Mr. Lal, can you check your mic? Yeah. No, you're not audible. Okay. Okay, speak something. Not yet. Can you just check the audio connection from there? Kom, can you hear Mr. Lal as of yet?
No, I can't hear anything right now.
No, not yet, not yet.
So while he fixes, you can ask your question.
Can you do one thing? Can you just take out the earphone and try once with the direct phone?
Me now?
Yes, we can
Yes,
hear you.
yes.
Now we can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Now you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Rajesh Bhai, namaskar. I just want to introduce Rajesh Bhai to all of you. He is retired Air Vice Marshal from the Air Force. He's the illustrious son of an illustrious father, Professor B.B. Lal, who completed 1800 years in May.
Wow.
And he has been co-authoring some of my books on ancient Indian civilization and culture, the latest being the Mahabharata, connecting with the Mahabharata. And the most important part is that his lovely wife ensures that I get my food every day, because she knows I'm not able to cook and I cannot go near the gas. So she ensures. And Rajesh Bhai, thank you so much. I must acknowledge this. Please tell Shushma ji that everybody is really.
No, that's hardly anything, Neeraj.
Oh, no, thank you. So he's
So
my
nice of
neighbor
you to-
also, and all during this COVID period when my servant had to leave, it's been like it's like a home, I just have to make a call and aaj ye nahi, bhabhi ji, aaj ye chahiye. So please, Rajesh Bhai, thank you.
Aryan, I'm going to try once more putting my headphone and tell me if it's okay. If it's not okay, I'll remove it and then talk. Okay.
आप try कर लीजिए एक बार और try.
This is pretty good. I think this is.
No, your audio is pretty good. Now try again. No, I think there's an issue with the mic, I guess.
Rajesh Bhai, we can hear you. So aap bole, please.
My question related to a bit of a statement about archaeoastronomy that you referred to. It's not a question, it's an observation. I'm sure you agree to that with that also, because you did mention about it. While discussing the date of Kurukshetra war, your starting point is always Bhishma's death. When the sun was moving to Uttarayan, it was Magh, and it was Ashtami, and it was noon. So that is a starting point for almost all people who are dating Mahabharata. How is it that we have a span of 4,000 years between one observation of 1450 and the other observation of 5,500? From one setting of Mahabharata, why the span so much? That's my first question. And my second question is that is it possible that various people are using various softwares and the algorithms may be different? Is that one reason that could is that one reason that could give us a wide variation?
Well, first, I would not want to speak on behalf of
I think to listen to you, I'm going to put this on because my
yeah.
Yes, I think that will be a better idea. Right.
Well, no, I was saying that I would not want to speak on behalf of archaeoastronomers because I'm not one of them, and they have their own very sophisticated calculations, which you cannot necessarily easily dispute that because they go by certain interpretations of Sanskrit names and words, which may not always be entirely clear or unequivocal. I mean, for example, they find certain constellations, and as you know, Sanskrit is a language of metaphors. So there are so many different names for many different things that sometimes you cannot quite be sure of what constellation or planet is being alluded to. So I have my own doubts about that, but generally speaking, I don't think you're talking about 4,000 years difference. You are talking about now reasonably those who are in the range of 1500 BCE, which by the way is accepted with by a number of serious scholars trained in the, you might say in the academic mainstream, because it's highly plausible, and you find that the Sanoli chariot shows you that technologically it was possible to wage the war with chariots at that time, around that period. And then again, they take into account the precession of equinoxes, which some others seem to be ignoring. And that has been, I think, the forte of Mr. Bhatnagar. On the other hand, those who go back to, of course, the dating provided initially in the Arabatiya, and then they go by these epigraphic inscriptions, in Aiole, then they of course end up saying, no, it has to be 3000 Sora because it coincides with the traditional chronology, and on top of that, we can prove it according to the astronomical data. I think these are the two basic alternatives. I frankly don't think we can stick anymore to the date of 800 BCE because there are a number of criteria that are not met by that date, and the archaeological evidence is insufficient. So we should probably not stick to that. We should probably think that it did take place around the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, or so those who are traditionally minded will say, no, we have to stick to the original concept, the original date, which has to do with the initial traditional start of Kali Yuga. But that is also controversial, even from a purely traditional viewpoint, because as you know, some scholars do not agree that Kali Yuga began at that date, because we all know what the arguments are about that, pro and con. So I myself don't see why I should take a position, because frankly, it's something to be, there is not enough evidence. And as we have said in some of the previous seminars, one key could be the discovery of the real ruins of Dwaraka. If Dwaraka were to be discovered under the sea, and we could date it approximately, then we would know that the date of Dwaraka being submerged is probably around the time when Mahabharata war was fought. And that would clinch the issue. By the way, I've just seen a news item which I have sent to Niraji just 5 minutes ago, showing that they have now identified by satellite a submerged island off the coast of Kerala. So you can find that if there was an island and it was submerged when the sea levels went up a few thousand years ago, there is probably some archaeological evidence on that island too, because, that was obviously part of Greater India. It gives you a sense that the Kumarakandam tradition is based on fact, that Kumarakandam was probably the land that connected East Africa to India, and that was submerged. And to my mind, the latest, one of the fragments of Kumarakandam has kept the name because it's the Kumari Islands, which are known as the Comores, and these are near Madagascar, and these are probably a fragment of Kumarakandam.
Well, Mr. Lal, you have any more question on this?
We'll leave it at that.
Anybody else?
Okay, no, I do have a question. In fact, yeah, Kom, we have been talking about a bigger vision. So my question, I had 7 questions, and 4 of them you have already answered in your explanation. So I was all set to target you with the questions, but you didn't give me an opportunity. But I'll definitely like to talk about the bigger vision. So when you're talking about a bigger vision, we do have 2 ideas, okay, which we think is very, very important at this moment. One on a global level, and definitely for India. See, when we are born, when we are a child, everything we listen from our mom and dad, mother and father, they are the reality. So when we start going to school, when we learn from our teacher, we listen to them, that becomes a reality. And when we grow up a little, we start reading books, that becomes a reality for us. But however, then we start reading history and we start exploring it. By the time we start doing that, our mindset is already taken a shape. What we want to know is, don't you think that we should make a subject? So when we read history, because history it's a combination of facts, it's a combination of narratives, it's a combination of political, religion, and regional, demographic, and economical and ideological narratives. So my question is, shouldn't we have a very strong compulsory chapter in our history curriculum which talks about how to approach history and how to evaluate history and how to evaluate the information that you receive? And I'm talking about just not in Indian level, in global level, so that every human being, they truly understand, okay, they don't get carried away by the narratives, but they truly understand the essence of history, the reality of history, and try to merge it in a global level. And there is a second layer to this question. Is it possible for all of us globally to establish an organization which truly brings the facts of history? Because every country, say, if you're talking about Western historians, they have their own narratives. Our nationalistic historians, we are trying to establish certain things, okay, which are based on facts. Still, Aryan invasion theory is being accepted around places. So we have, from different demography, we have different vision. But can we create a global or true global organization which can say, okay, this is global history is all about? So these are 2 visions I want to know your opinion on.
The idea of creating a sort of a global common, I'll start with a second question. History is not easy to implement, even though it sounds very sensible, because let's face it, history is a narrative which is used by political powers to build a certain image of their own societies. So if you tell them we are going to write something which is going to be acceptable to all, they probably won't react very kindly to it, or at least they will not show a lot of enthusiasm, because they say, well, we can write, we have our own history and we know how to present it to our people. And there is a lot of writing about history of philosophy and how to have a perspective on history, but then perspectives on history are mostly ideological. It's very hard not to be ideological. Either you are a nationalist, or you are an internationalist, or you are interested in putting down the past, like the woke intellectuals are now doing. It was all terrible. We were all invaders, conquerors, colonizers, oppressors. So we should get rid of all that and just discover peace and love, which generally doesn't work anyway. But that's a sort of utopian idea. History is bad. It's about war and violence and all. So let's just forget about it. And on the other hand, you have those who have built these grand narratives in which their ancestors were heroes. I look at the Mongols, they love Genghis Khan because he massacred millions of people and destroyed half of Asia. But he was seen as a man who did what nobody else could do. And Napoleon is the same for the French. And I'm sure that if you give it another 100 years, Hitler will be the same for the Germans. So it's very difficult to build the common narrative because what is good for some is actually not very good at all for others. So they will not necessarily agree to give the equal perspective on the same people. On the other hand, if you are looking at giving people an understanding of how to think of history, that of course should be done, and it's in some way, in some countries, it's being done, not always very well, but at least there is an attempt to give people the ability to judge by themselves, not just to swallow a narrative hook, line, and sinker, but to understand why it is being shown to be that way, and why there are other perspectives which do not necessarily entirely contradict the first one, but which, there is an endless debate in India about whether Mughals any good or were they just to be completely, essentially reviled. Clearly, you cannot say that either one way or another. The Mughals brought a lot of things. They also destroyed a lot of things. Akbar was generally good, Aurangzeb was generally bad, but then, everything is this product of circumstances. Saying that Human Rights Commission were not appointed by Akbar is of course silly. People did not think in those terms. So you cannot blame them, and you cannot say, they should have been more humanitarian, they should have provided better facilities for refugees. I mean, the whole history of a people was built on the ability to wage war and win it. And it was considered a very heroic deed. And conquering new lands was part of the learning process. So that is something which probably will not change very easily. However, as people become more enlightened about other countries and other cultures, they understand that they are not the only game in town. In the past, people were brought up in the worship of their own history, and every other history was considered to be insignificant or derivative. Now we know that this is not so. I mean, you have to think of what other people have done and who did right and who did wrong. So hopefully that will develop a more balanced and inclusive narrative. But I would say that definitely in India, history should not be made into a tool for propagating a particular ideology one way or another. There should be a balance, but certainly it shouldn't be seen as, that it's built around a particular family or a particular, India did not exist before independence, or India did not exist before the British took it over. That kind of thing is obviously very subjective, and it's wrong. So that should be corrected. But of course, whatever you do, you are going to meet a lot of criticism because a lot of people will not agree with whatever you do. That's almost inevitable.
And about the first part of my question, okay, should we make it a subject compulsory where we are trained in the art and science of evaluating history and finding more facts about it, and just then getting carried away by any narratives. So for example, if I'm in 7th standard or 8th standard, if we have a curriculum where we say, okay, these are the facts, but history is always evolving with new facts which are coming up with new discoveries. So keep your mind open, other than believing in one stuck thing. So shouldn't we make this a compulsory subject, a part of history itself in the beginning?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, making people aware that we know very little, that we have tried to keep certain traditions and reconstruct certain forgotten facts, which cannot always be proven in the scientific text, according to the scientific method, and letting people look further and not get imprisoned in a particular narrative, like, for example, people in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia, who are told this is what happened and this is the perfect way, and anything else you hear is wrong, So that is not, obviously that's a very bad service to render to anyone, but we also have to keep in mind that actually people, especially children, are not really interested in facts. They are interested in legends. We are attracted to things that make us dream. So facts also have to be given. That's why mythology exists, in whatever name, by whatever name you call it, because facts are dry. People. I mean, I always said that one form of cruel and unusual punishment in the United States is the teaching of American history, because it's one of the most boring subjects you could imagine. Lawyers drafting articles and then people voting. There's no poetry there. It's much more interesting to learn about, the Digvijayas of Arjuna and his brothers and how they conquered those people and brought back their spoils. And so this is part of the human imagination, especially among very young people.
Do you understand? Okay, before I open this for everybody else, one little small question, very curious about it, especially because you are from Europe. So I'm very greedy to ask you a question. What is the perception among common people in Europe about Indian culture and history in today's date?
It's very diverse. You cannot find have a common standard because people now, they have much more access. I mean, in the past, we used to learn a few pages of history in childhood about India, so we knew they had great kings, including the Mughals, and they had a very ancient history, and they had elephants and great temples and wonderful palaces, and there were Maharajas who were very lavish. And then, they became independent in 1947. That was pretty much it. And India was a sort of a, poor country, but it was struggling to become more modern and all that. So that's pretty much what most people were taught in school. Now, of course, they can go on the internet, they can find million books, and also people have very diverse views. But by and large, unfortunately, the mainstream media tends to mold people's perception. And right now, many people, especially in Europe and the United States, and I don't say that it's necessarily the majority, but at least they are the people who are more likely to give you an opinion. They will tell you, oh yeah, but India has so many problems, and now they have a neo-fascist government which is Hindu nationalist, and they are persecuting the Muslims, and that is the idea that has been spread by a lot of the media and a lot of the so-called left-wing liberal intellectuals. So people tend to read that in the newspapers, and they say, yeah, there are riots, and the Muslims are not feeling secure, and they are trying to promote Hinduism, and that among many people in Europe is a bit suspicious because most people are still subconsciously brought up in this monotheistic or secular vision. So anything that's religious and on top of that polytheistic is seen as a very dangerous thing. I know people who have done yoga, who are very much into meditation, and they have followed some guru or another, but they are still very put off by the current political situation in India. They say, that's not what we want. We wanted Gandhi and, non-violence and peacefulness, and now we have this kind of very militant Hindu government. So that's the kind of image they have been given. So that is probably now the predominant image, which is, of course, not very fortunate, but that's the way it is.
Do you think the awareness about history is much more in India among youth than in the West, maybe US or Europe?
You mean of Indian history or world history?
The world history. I'm talking about history, the subject history itself.
Well, I don't think, to my knowledge, except for some maybe relatively elite colleges, I don't see there is much interest or knowledge of world history in India. I don't feel that way. Of course, there are individual students who are very keen, but by and large, I don't think it's a very, it's a subject of great interest because people are.
I think you have to come again. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you have to come again because you had a little technical interruption. We could not get the session properly.
No, in one sentence, I just thought that for many people here as students, there are so many other priorities, because basically studies is about getting a good job and getting the right note, the right marks. And I don't think history is seen as a priority. So most people would not find it very interesting. They may know a few things, but by and large, not very much. In fact, I must say, I'm surprised about some of my relatively, upper class friends who went to the best colleges and, they can barely tell apart Napoleon from Mussolini. They have very scanty notions of history, even in India. But when it comes to foreign history, then it's really poor. Because obviously they haven't been given a lot of focus. They haven't been taught a lot about history, or if they were taught something, they promptly forgot it because it wasn't of use to them. And they needed any kind of trade to make good in life, and history was just an intellectual pastime. There was nothing else.
I completely agree with you. When you said that history is not a priority, that's exactly what we are aiming at. If you don't keep something in priority, let me try to explore. So some or other way, we are trying to inspire this subject becomes a little more priority among youth. So that's the attempt we have here. Now I open this session completely to people.
I think Anil Gupta ji, Jijit may have questions, I think.
Yes, Anil Gupta ji, namaskar. I think we have been speaking on phone for some time, but aaj milne ka mauka hua aaj.
And Jijit, please ask questions.
Jijit, please. You're mute. Gupta ji, you're mute.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, you are.
Yeah. Uh, Let me first tell about myself. I was associated with the Niraji for quite some time, about 13, 14 years. And while working with her project at Campillia, I was with ITDC, and in the later part for about 8 to 9 years, I've been dealing with the sound and light show projects all over the country. And presently, I'm a retired person associated with many other things side by side. Now, today in this particular session, I am really very much moved by Kaum Saab, that though he is from Europe, but he has such a in-depth knowledge about Indian culture and history. Then Vice Marshal Saab, really, I used to think that I am an engineer. I didn't get much time to study about the history and in the Sanskriti of India, but the kind of knowledge he has possessed, it's really it's very admirable. Uh, then Mr. RC, really, he's much younger to me, and the kind of knowledge he has gained and asked the questions, thrown some questions, it is also admirable. Uh, One question which has been raised by Mr. Aryan, that is about the subject we should have in India about this, to inculcate our history amongst the children. That's very important, and I think it should be there, which I also missed. And we have been taught history which was totally distorted and which we have come to know in last few years. And that's perhaps a reason that what Mr. Com said, that the kind of perception which has come out in European countries about India, that we are moving towards Hinduism and all that, which should not have happened. Had this been had this history been taught in India in a proper way, till now, in last about 40, 60, 70 years, this position would have not arrived. I have no question today, because I'm not much into it. I'm a man of infrastructure of tourism and such locations, and we have been working with Niraji and many other organizations on this. So I don't have any question, but certainly I'll be associated with any kind of activity once it comes to some shape. Uh, like what we had thought, that Purana Kila, which is basically Indraprastha of that ancient time, and which now it is predicted as depicted as a Mughal structure, which is total distorting the image of our uh, Indian actual history. So once it comes to that stage, and when we are really able to change the name of the city, then I think something much better can be done, which is the theme, which is the main motto of our PM and the present government. Thank you.
Jijit, you have any questions?
Yes, Jijit, do you have any question?
Yeah, actually, I've listened the wonderful talk of Komji, and he's a well-known to me. I have been interacting with him for the last 2-3 years in various conferences, etc. And it was great to know about the Indraprastha and its the significance of Prastha in the outside of India, like how that the word Prastha has been used in other languages. Yeah, so that is very much of a new information to me, and I'm very thankful to Komji about telling about that. And I don't have, like Rajesh ji, I don't have any particular question, but I've been associated with illuminating Indraprastha and its significance through my art as well as scientific research. So certain aspects I need to discuss. So once the Rajesh ji mentioned about the dating. So I mean, I think the Comji has fully well aware of that, but I'm just saying it for the general audience who are just may not be having the insider understanding of it, because so many people I've seen, they just go by a particular date and then they fix on that as if the problem is solved. And I see a lot of information circulating in WhatsApp and Facebook about exact date of birth of Krishna, etc. So one thing is that this particular aspect is not settled actually, and Niraji and Komji, they are working for creating a consensus of the dates of Kurukshetra war. So I agree with Komji about certain dates are becoming stronger, like the 1793 date of Ashok Bhatnagar ji. I see it is falling in the same period suggested by Sanjay Manjul, who is an archaeologist. He gave a date of range of date for Kurukshetra war of 1800 BC to 1700 BC. So 100 years of range he has given based on the current understanding. And exactly falling within, we have got an archaeoastronomy based date from Ashok Bhatnagar. So there is a very good strength there. And again, we have so many cluster of dates at 3100 BC. They are also stronger in other different aspects. So in terms of traditionally very much accepted. And of course, if you must, for example, Aryan have an interest in creating the history textbooks, etc., based on whatever we know till date, then the best way to be faithful to whatever we know in the scientific community to is say that, okay, we have got dates emerging around 1700 BC, 1500 BC, as well as some cluster of dates in 3100 BC. And like that, if you make a statement and goes to the school textbooks, or if you have it on in your video clips or something to popularize our history, then it will be very much faithful. So beyond that, if you're planning to fix on a particular date, then it is like a premature at this current moment. Maybe some 4 or 5 years of debate and discussions, we may arrive at one of the date to be very strong, etc. So I fully agree with Pomji about and Rajesh ji and Bibilal ji have done a lot of work, and I know that the dates are little more lower at 800, 900 BC, but this is a matter that archaeologists themselves can settle out, because Sanjay Manjul ji is like a shishya of Dr. Bibilal ji. He has based on whatever Bibilal has discovered from 40 or 50 years ago onwards. On top of that, he has done research and then identified the new range, which is 1700 to 1800 BC. So this is a very interesting time from 2020 onwards, starting with Niraj's Kurukshetra conference happened in February 2021. We got a date which is agreed in agreement with archaeology as well as archaeoastronomy, and that is something that we need to congratulate all of us about, that it has come about. And yes, and this is not something which can be ended in a single conference, and then there will be a lot of debate and discussions will be going on. And Niraji and Komji through the India Foundation, we are planning to have more and more conferences on this particular aspect. So we will switch to one of them. Personally, I have very good strength I see in 1700 BC, because it's archaeology supported as well as archaeoastronomy supported. Dyausya and Thara, the two witness of all the events happening on Earth, they are agreeing on that date. But I have not 100% fixed on that particular date. The other people who are working on 3100 BC, like Manish Pandit ji and Vedavira, all of my friends. In fact, almost half of the archaeoastronomers who are working on the dating of Mahabharata, all of my colleagues and my friends, and I have full support to them and very happy about it. And thanks for this particular wonderful talk. It has added to my knowledge, and I'm very thankful about that. Thank you.
Well, we have Mr. Shashi Gupta also. I mean, he has been a silent observer.
Yeah, so he can please ask him to ask any questions.
Mr. Shashi Gupta, do you have a question?
I'm sorry that I have to beg you to be able to leave in about 5 minutes because the office is going to close and I need to get some things done. So.
All right, Kom. In case Mr. Gupta doesn't have a question at this moment, so I would rather say we want Kom to get back again and again. We are going to explore a lot of topics which we'll share with you. In fact, we have a lot many things in our mind. We are gradually, this is just the beginning. We are trying to explore a few things and then we are trying to build up certain queries which we want to discuss and with experts and stalwarts like you. I leave it to Niraji to conclude the session.
Thank you so very much, Kom. It was really as always, a great privilege and pleasure and honor to be listening to you and giving so much of time. And as I had told you informally also, that we are planning to make these videos and sort of put them on in a very aggressive way so that the message reaches across. And that is why he said we will keep inviting you more and more. And one thing that I wanted to very keenly hear, but I think the time constraint is there, specifically about Indra in different things which you had written for that article in my this thing. So maybe another day we'll have a short 15-minute lecture with you on that. But that is also, but today you gave some wonderful information. So we are really, I would not say information, knowledge. So thank you so very much, Kom. As always, you are such a great supporter of what little things that we can do together, and we will keep doing together. Thank you so much.
Next time I'll be ready with 15 questions because you already answered 5. Thank you, Kom. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
RC left. Has RC out? Is RC gone? Is RC there?
Yeah, RC. I think RC has left here to leave for this thing.
His screen is off.
Yes, his screen is off.
Okay.
All right. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Vijay, Dr. Gupta ji, and others who of course left. Thank you so much for.
Thank you for inviting me. Great pleasure. Bye-bye. Good evening.